Hello, everybody. This is App Architecture Q&A number 13. And I have Chris with me remotely. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
And Matt is also with us from Australia.
Hello.
So let's get right into it. The early access period is nearing its end, I'd say. We are making good progress. Let's see. We will definitely have another Q&A next week. So if you have more questions, then we are definitely available there. And other than that, I'd say let's just get started. So the first question is from Andrew. And he sent a question via Twitter where he says, it seems you're all independent consultants. In what way do you think this influences your views on application architecture, if at all? What might be different between a consultant who stays on a project 6 months versus an employee 3 years? Matt, what do you think about it?
I mean, from my perspective, I get most of my jobs through people thinking of me as an authority on app design and iOS implementation. So I'm always mindful of trying to maintain that reputation. So I'm always trying to talk about best practice and trying to deliver it. So, I mean, to me, being an independent consultant means working really hard to kind of prove my skills each time. And even though I live in Melbourne, which is a pretty big city, the iOS development world here isn't so big that I can, damage my reputation. So, I'm always working hard to, make sure I get jobs in the future.
Chris, do you have any experience with this?
Yeah, I think, well, yes, there is this, I think what's maybe hidden in the question is some kind of, also this question of, as a consultant, you can make a mess and walk away after 3 months. And yeah, you can, but as Matt said, that can destroy your reputation. So it can also go the other way around. I once did a project where it was a simple feature to add to an existing app. I'd not really seen the app, but fairly straightforward, and it looked like it would take me 1 or 2 days. So we decided on 2 days. They wanted a fixed price. I started working. Turned out to be a huge mess. There was almost no architecture. Or rather, the architecture was copy and paste, and every little thing and every big thing was copy and pasted everywhere. There was no sharing of code. And as a consultant, I felt like it was my duty to talk about this with the CEO. It was a smallish company, maybe 10 or 15 people. And so I had this conversation with the CEO and the CTO, and the CTO was the guy who actually wrote the mess. I didn't know that, but he defended himself by saying, well, it's a different style of programming. I come from VB scripts, and that's how you do things there. And it's not wrong. It's just different. So as a consultant, I wanted to do a little bit. I wanted to have a nicer architecture, and they didn't. And they like working in that kind of architecture. So even though I think they're wrong, if it works for them, they should just do it. And yeah, I don't know. I think, as Matt said in the beginning, your reputation is pretty important as a consultant. So it's what you get your next job out of. So it's more important to keep that up than to try the latest thing and make a mess.
Yeah, we didn't consider the copy and paste architecture for the book, didn't we?
No, but it's easy to make it, right? Like you can just start with MVC and copy and paste everything. I'll give it a try.
Nice. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And this is from Germund. And he asks if there will also be, okay, so this is in the context of the networking chapter. We just released the first part of this last week. And the first part describes a controller-owned networking approach. And the second half, which is not yet released, describes a model-owned networking approach. And he asks if there will also be an example of model-owned networking with the Elm architecture. Chris, Chris, you're the Elm architecture man.
Well, no, I just implemented it in Swift, but yeah, well, you're the networking man, so I think what I can say is that in Elm there is no controller, so it doesn't really make sense. So in MVC there's a big difference of whether your controller owns all the networking stuff and the model objects, or if you have a model layer that does it. And in Elm we do have a separate store, but the app state in Elm is basically the model, so it's both part of the model layer, so you couldn't really do a controller owned networking even if you wanted to. So the only networking that exists is model owned. What do you think, Florian?
Yeah, I think the distinction just doesn't make sense anymore in this context. So any kind of networking you implement in the Elm architecture will be or could be called something like model-owned networking, but it's maybe just networking because there is nothing else than putting it on this level and integrating it with the app state, basically. So what we write in the chapter is specifically written in the context of architectures like MVC. So it would also apply to something like MVVM, for example. Already with an architecture like MVC plus view state, as we have described in the book, even there, what we describe as controller-owned doesn't really exist, because the whole point of MVC plus view state is to move view state into the model layer. And so therefore, if you try to do controller-owned networking, this would immediately get pushed back into the model layer. So it applies to MVC and related architectures primarily, and in other architectures, the networking somehow naturally moves into the model layer, and the distinction doesn't make sense. So that's why we don't have any explicit example of that for the Elm architecture of this distinction. So let's see, what else do we have? We have a question from Domash, and he observed that in our sample code, specifically in the MVC sample code, but in others as well, we use storyboards. And well, he just asks the question about what we think about storyboards and nib files and maybe views in code. And so there are lots of strong opinions about this out there. And what do we think about that? And why did we do it the way we did it? Matt?
When we started writing this book, particularly with the MVC architecture, we wanted to do something that was very traditionally following Apple's guidelines for building simple applications. So we wanted to start literally with the master detail template for building an application and go from there. And so in terms of following Apple's advice and guidelines and templates, that's why we felt we had to use storyboards and segues and do it very much as Apple's basic documentation suggests. As to whether or not, we think storyboards are good and great and wonderful, I mean, they have their problems. They want you to use view state in the view controllers, and they want you to serialize that view state using the storyboard persistence layer. And segues make it very difficult to pass data between view controllers. So there are some problems here, but with most of these things, there's ways around them. You can handle persistence on your own. Our MVC plus view state just uses the app delegate methods for getting notifications about when view state is being triggered, and does its own view state persistence entirely on its own. We show in the MVC chapter how you can pass data to a storyboard when you instantiate it, so you can deal with it in much the same way as you might deal with a raw nib file. So I think there are ways around the shortcomings of storyboards. I would like Apple to update them. I would like Apple to improve them. but I don't think there's a reason to say, no, don't use storyboards. And particularly when you're communicating a new project to someone for the first time, storyboards are very helpful to say, look, this is our app. This is the workflow it goes through. And maybe you've got, a really good UX engineer who's got these big workflows outside of the development environment. And that's okay. But the storyboards in Xcode are always going to be more up to date and more accurately reflecting your application. So they're very helpful as a communication tool, even if they can be fiddly and you can get things wrong. And they're this whole extra topic that you need to learn about if you want to use them. You know, people will give you a whole lot of opinions on them. They're not perfect, but you can work with them and they don't stop you doing anything.
Yeah, I can maybe add that for me, if I was just writing a project just on my own and I didn't have to work with anybody else and didn't have to share the code, I would use a lot of functional programming and I would definitely not use storyboards. The moment I'm working with other people, I don't mind using storyboards at all. They're very useful, and you can use different level of storyboardness. So you can go all the way for put everything in one storyboard, use the storyboard for styling as well as layout, or you can do a little bit less and, for example, not do the styling in the storyboard. You can also use, like multiple people suggested in a discussion thread, you can use storyboard references, and you can also sort of build down the level of storyboardness in your app. And there's all these graduations that you can pick from. So I think that also you should take that into account when you're choosing whether or not to use storyboards. But there's nothing wrong with using them, and some things might even become simpler.
Yeah. So then I will try to break down a longer question. So this one is from Priyansh, and he actually sent us a playground. And so I will try to distill down what he was talking about in this playground, or the issues he tried to outline. And I'd say, so the first part is about reusing table view logic. So you have this table view, and then you need to provide data sources, a data source, maybe delegate to it, and maybe use this in a couple of places in your app. And so how do you make this reusable? Because you write a lot of the same code again and again, and how do you make this reusable? And so the first question or an idea he put forward is, why don't you just subclass UI table view and make the subclass the table view's delegate and data source, and then you can just use the subclass anywhere and just configure it maybe with some specific parts, or override something in the subclass to make it work specifically for a certain screen. Matt, what do you think about subclassing your table view and using this as the data source?
In general, subclassing table view is a bad idea. The reason is that the whole class has been designed to be driven through UI table view delegate and UI table data source. And if you're not driving the class this way, you're going to run into problems where behavior just doesn't work the way you expect. But from another perspective, you have to think about the reason why there aren't reusable UI view controllers in a general sense. And the reason is that the role of a controller, the role of a view controller, is to connect the components of your program. It's an integration class. It integrates different components from different places and brings them together. That logic isn't repeatable. It's unique within each program, and so you can't really put it into a reusable class. When you try to, you'll find that you need to keep extending and changing that behavior every time, to the point where you've really got 10 different view controllers just baked into a single view controller. And that's going to be the same problem if you try to push your view controller logic down into the view and reuse it. I mean, ultimately you're sort of turning that view into another view controller, just a sort of sub-view controller. And when you try to make it repeatable, you're going to run into difficulties. But that said, I mean, the question goes on to talk about having this same view controller used at different points in the app. I mean, that's not too uncommon. A single app can often reuse view controllers. Navigation stacks almost always have deep hierarchies built from a single kind of view controller. It can be done within certain contexts in a single app, particularly if the construction of it is data-driven. But in other cases, sometimes it's just, yeah, you might have 4 tabs all displaying a slight variant on the same idea. You can do it. But there is just that problem with, as you need to connect different components, you're not going to be able to design a class that does that every time. So sometimes you just, you have to write a unique view controller.
Yeah. So I do have some sympathy with the sentiment of the question because, yes, on the one hand, as you said, Matt, view controllers should be really specific and integrate all these different parts in a very specific way. But for example, often you see view controllers being made the table views data source and delegate, and then at least part of this stuff is repeated in all these view controllers that serve as your table view data sources, for example. And to try to avoid this repetition, I can sympathize with this. And the idea of pulling it into a UI table view subclass is like unconventional and kind of, it's not really what you would expect, because you would expect these kind of customizations and this kind of working with your app's data and basically preparing it for the view to be happening in the controller layer. So basically what you would do, what this would mean effectively is that you push the code that you would normally have in your controller layer into this view subclass and therefore move the complexity around basically. And this might work fine. It's not really that this can't work at all, but it's definitely unconventional. And I would suggest to go a different way or to try out different things. So you could, instead of subclassing the table view itself and putting this common logic of a data source, for example, in there, you could create, you could put this logic in a dedicated class. So this would be just a data source class that you can reuse. Or then with Swift, especially, you can use features like generics and create a whole generic table view controller that is generic over the data that is being displayed. And that's also a way to make whole table view controllers reusable. Sometimes, at least, that works. And so I think while technically you could move this stuff in a UI table view subclass, it's definitely unexpected. And I think there are better ways of making something like this reusable. Chris, do you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I would agree with what the two of you said. I wouldn't do this. That said, I don't think there's a problem. You can do it and it's fine. You can put all your, if you have a table view, and then you can put all of the data source and delegate logic inside a custom subclass, and I think it will work fine. You can have exactly the same program as if you would move it out into some kind of abstract component. That said, if you ever had the problem of large view controllers and you think it's an actual problem, then you'll probably have similar problems with the approach of putting everything into a subclass. Because one of the problems with large view controllers is that they have too many responsibilities. And if you're putting controller logic inside your views, then your views will have a lot of responsibilities. And this makes it harder to change them. This makes it harder to test them. And definitely harder to reuse. That said, some people like having all their code in one place. So I actually can understand why somebody would like a large view controller. So working in it every day and they know exactly where to find things, maybe it's not a problem. And likewise, creating some highly specific views for your application that you're not going to want to reuse anyway, why not? I wouldn't do it, but if you like that, go for it.
So there's a related follow-up question basically to this, and that extends this kind of idea. And he says, well, if this would work for your table view, why not use the same approach in other places? So, for example, let's say you have a screen with multiple login buttons. So you can log in with Facebook, you can log in with Twitter, and all these kind of things. So couldn't you just create a Facebook login UI button subclass and make it an encapsulated component, basically? So everything is in this UI button subclass. So the whole networking logic, communicating this with the server, checking this data that comes back from it, everything is in this button, so that this button becomes this reusable component which you can plug in anywhere. Matt, what do you think about this idea?
I mean, I'm puzzled slightly by the idea that networking code would live inside the button, simply because, I mean, are you talking about literally putting all of your networking code in the same file? But obviously, you're always going to have components in your program where this is the only, the logic associated with this button is the only logic that uses, all of this code that you've imported over here. That's going to happen all of the time. That doesn't mean you literally have to write it in the same file inside the same UI button subclass. I mean, again, though, it's kind of what Chris said. You can do it. I mean, you're not going to break the world with it, but it doesn't really make sense to locate your code like that. It makes a lot more sense to just have a view be a view. And when it needs to do networking stuff, well, it just references code over here and it does all of that. And maybe it's the only part of your program that references that code, and that's fine. And you can still move it around and it will still feel like a discrete reusable component. But in programming, you don't literally have to put everything inside things for them to be neat and tidy.
Yeah, I think this idea of creating a reusable component for something like this is a good idea, and I think you can pursue this goal in different ways. And so within this reusable component, you can definitely make this work, just putting everything into this subclass. But I think it's more a matter of practicing good habits or something like that, because this is something you encounter all the time, these kind of issues, these questions of where do you draw the boundaries, what kind of interfaces do you put in between stuff, and you encounter them in small components and in large components. And I think it's more kind of a good practice to even think about this in a small component and maybe not stuff all your networking code into the view subclass, but build up a small set of layers for this specific component maybe, and separate the code so that your networking code is not within the view subclass. And yeah, it's maybe more a matter of something like developer hygiene or something like that. But of course, if you are very, very proficient in what you're doing, you can also sometimes break the rules and have good results with that. Chris, do you have any closing remarks on this?
Yeah, I agree with what both of you said. I'm trying to think of other examples. There are some very complicated view components. I think something like UI text fields or UI text view, they have a lot of logic in there. It's super simple to use them. They're reusable. You can use them in any project, but they also have all these points of customization. And so what they did is they made a very simple component, at least simple to use, and then it exists, or it is sort of combined out of other components. So it's, again, separated into logical pieces, which means that you can use a different layout mechanism, for example, or with all the delegate methods, you can change the way the text fields work. And you have all these customization points. And I imagine like in the question, if you want to have a Facebook login button, well, there are some things you don't want to change, like the fact that it logs into Facebook. But then what do you do with the result of that, or how does it interact with the rest of your code? And that's definitely something you want to be able to configure. So I don't know. It's an interesting question, trying to move all of your logic into these views. But even if you do that, I would recommend thinking about if you can split that up into components still.
Yeah, you can also just try both approaches. Just write the same thing in multiple ways and see how you feel about it. Okay, so that's, let me check. Yeah, that's all the questions we have for this week. We'll be doing another Q&A next week. So if you have any more questions, then send them to us via Twitter or GitHub issues or whatever channel you prefer. And then we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.